Hi, everyone. We're going to start in half a minute. I'd just like to call your attention to this amazing photograph, which completely coincidentally I took on one of the trips to Belfast. It's on the peace walls, which we'll hear about. So it's actually, this is barbed wire. The peace wall with the barbed wire. And I just thought this is like the coolest. It's full of murals that are painted, and this one, right? So it's Mandela with the flag of, first of all, Ireland behind him in South Africa. And in my country, we go to prison first and then become president. So in my country, sometimes it's the opposite. In at least one case. But I don't know. There's something that just seemed to really speak to the topic of the conference. And second, so we have students from those Northern Ireland trips, which were 8 to 10 years ago, trickling in now to the conference. Two are already here. They're primarily coming to meet Roisin, who, while I'm speaking, can come and sit at the table. Some of them vaguely remember that Kieran was also met them when they were in Belfast, and more will be coming during the day. So that's very cool. It's always really wonderful when these reuniting with students from a long time ago. And there are also 2 PhD students of Ron's in the room, and that's just like a strange thing to say, but like, right? I mean, that Ron has PhD students. For you, it's like grandchildren, right? I mean, Kieran was Ron's supervisor. So, if Ron gives you a hard time, just come to Kieran and he'll. So that's it. So that was the substantive part of the day, and now we'll continue with this.
Thank you, Danny. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Kieran McAvoy. I'm a law professor from Queen's in Belfast, and I'm chairing the next session. It's my honour and privilege to introduce our 2 speakers this morning. I think both are going to speak for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So we'll run the 2 speakers back to back, basically, and then we'll do the Q&A. So it's my honour and privilege to introduce first Sergio Jaramillo Caro. Sergio served as High Commissioner for Peace for former President Juan Manuel Santos, a Colombian former president and 2016 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. As a former national security advisor, Sergio led the secret negotiations with Colombia's largest guerrilla group, FARC. He then served for 5 years as the High Commissioner for Peace. Prior to serving in that role, he served as Vice Minister of Defence for Policy and International Affairs, and he was responsible for security, policy, intelligence and human rights. He also served as Colombian Ambassador to the EU and Belgium from 2017 till 2018, and he's currently a Senior Advisor to the European Institute of Peace in Brussels. Sergio studied philosophy and Greek at the University of Toronto and at Oxford University. He also holds a Master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and he did postgraduate work in Greek at the University of Heidelberg. Sergio.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Danny and Minerva, for this invitation to the Hebrew University. I've never been here, so I'm really very, very happy, and to Kieran for making the connection, and you all for the interest. I thought I'd call my little remarks today Transitional Justice in the Mud, by which I mean I have no quarrel with all the discussion about transitional justice as an academic field, and we actually sort of read, if not every printed word, really sort of dozens and dozens of articles and books. But what I want to try and convey to you today is what it looks like on the ground. And I will begin with something that I think Ron alluded to yesterday, which is, as you all know, transitional justice is an unfinished project. And one of the problems it has, which was pointed out by my dear friend and good friend of Kieran's as well, Pablo de Greif, when he was the first Special Rapporteur for Transitional Justice of the UN, which is the problem of throwing everything to one basket. You're moving from a dictatorship to democracy, you're moving from war to peace, and you call it all transitional justice. And there are some very serious differences in those transitions. First obvious one is the number of victims when you're talking about war to peace. It's a completely different scale. The fact that because things tend to be horizontal, you will find all kinds of gray areas, many more cases of perpetrators who may have also been victims. You have to think about indirect victims. I will be talking a little bit about that. You have to think about also how socioeconomic rights are affected. There was a brilliant lecture given almost 20 years ago at NYU by Louise Arbour when she was still High Commissioner of Human Rights on this issue of socioeconomic rights and human rights, and how actually in conflict settings they may often be as important as other rights. Colombia has over 7 million internally displaced people, and for some of those people losing all their belongings, their land, and having miserable lives in shanty towns and cities was as hard as it may say, as losing one of their loved ones. But the main one thing I want to emphasize is that in the case of war to peace transitions, then almost inevitably justice will be the result of a negotiation. And when you say transitional justice, you cannot just discuss the justice bit of it, you have to discuss the transition bit of it, because unless you have a justice formula, you are not going to get a transition. In the other transitions, you have to give guarantees. Sometimes the rulers will not leave unless they have some guarantees. But on the whole, it's more a question of the stability of the post-authoritarian regime rather than the transition coming about. And that is a very, very serious difference. At the same time, I don't think we want to over-theorize things. And I take issue with the idea put forth by a brilliant legal scholar who is also a friend of mine, Christine Bell from Northern Ireland, who in a recent paper said that in the case of authoritarian transitions, you are doing everything within the framework of human rights and standard doctrine, but actually in the case of war to peace, it was more a kind of issue of trade-offs, and it was quite different. And I don't think that's quite right. I think that's actually false, because especially if you're doing this in a democracy, you will find you have all kinds of constraints, constitutional constraints about what you can actually negotiate. And we were absolutely negotiating within the framework of human rights and law, which I'll be referring to. But we're also negotiating with all kinds of political limitations. And I think that the subset of transitions which I actually find more interesting is what colleagues from Kira in Northern Ireland about 20 years ago started calling conflicted democracies. War to peace in democracies. This is a particular category, and some of you may know a brilliant paper written by Ian Shapiro and some other Yale people comparing South Africa, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East, and with great insights exactly about the politics of the negotiations, and with quite actually right emphasis on don't concentrate so much or only on the negotiations, concentrate on the politics of how this all works. So these things are really very, very serious. The other thing is that if you're in a democracy that's conflicted, then the concept of transition itself is more complicated, and it's sometimes less evident. So Ron was talking yesterday about transitional justice when you don't have a transition. Well, this is how we actually got started. The first big exercise in transitional justice in Colombia was the so-called Justice and Peace Law that was used as a legal framework to demobilize what we call the paramilitary militias. And at the time, nobody could see that there was an obvious transition. But then now, with hindsight, you see what you have is actually a phased transition. And so there's actually a case for getting some things going, but also a case for not spending some cartridges you may need later on, like, for example, truth commissions. But in the end, it is possible to do this, and what I'm going to try and show you is how it was done in Colombia. Since 2004, we were under preliminary examination by the ICC, and the Prosecutor General in November came to Colombia and signed an agreement and closed the examination of Colombia because he was convinced, and this is the first in the world, that the system we had set up was Article 17 compliant and that there was no need, and Camilo will tell you more about the HEP, that there was no need to continue with this investigation. And you can see now videos on YouTube of FARC commanders of the highest rank going before a tribunal and acknowledging the commission of war crimes and apologizing to the victims. And you will see retired Colombian army officers doing the same thing before victims of extrajudicial executions. And you wonder, how could that be possible? And I'm going to explain to you very quickly how we got there. I also want to show you about a 10-12 minute video. So I'm going to be very succinct in my explanations, and then perhaps in the Q&A we can go in depth. But I'll basically enumerate 7 or 8 moves, steps, strategies, so why this was possible. So very quickly, first thing, we actually first set up a proper framework, meaning first a conceptual framework for all of this, and this was a move we very consciously made in 2010, where President Santos formally, through a law, which I'll talk about, acknowledged that in Colombia there was an internal armed conflict. This was something that was very debated, and those who think this is a strange thing because we obviously have a war going on, it isn't so strange. Some other places, for example in Northern Ireland, it was never acknowledged. And in our case, this was a critical move because, well, it gave us the right narrative for what we were trying to do. We were trying to end the armed conflict. It created a more horizontal approach, which gave the other side, the FARC, a measure of dignity in the proceedings, always very important in these things. And it put up front the basic legal framework, which was IHL for determining what were the violations. Not the only one, but the main one. At the same time, we built on a really very complex and frankly solid legal and constitutional framework in Colombia, made up of first a law that had been passed already by the paramilitary and a landmark sentence by the Constitutional Court of Colombia that I encourage you all to read if you're interested in such things, from 2006, which was the judicial review of that Justice and Peace law, where the Colombian Constitutional Court frankly does a magnificent job of doing what such modern constitutionalists do, which is to try and weigh the right to peace and the right to justice. The right to peace is actually in the Colombian Constitution, and turn this into a practical legal framework for how to evaluate how far you can go and what's considered constitutional and what not. And building on that, then the government of Colombia in 2011 passed a bill which is known as the Victims Bill, which is a big thing because it contained what is actually to this day the biggest reparation program in the world, and also a very ambitious land restitution program. This is before we even started talking to the FARC. Ban Ki-moon came down as Secretary General for the signing of that bill by the President. And then on top of that, still because we knew we were going to negotiate with FARC, but we also had some very serious problems with the previous transitional justice law, which wasn't so transitional and had dispersed its efforts into millions of cases. We passed through Congress a constitutional amendment. Took us a year of work, which is known as the Legal Framework for Peace, which basically is a kind of constitutional interpretation of the vision that is in the famous Kofi Annan document of 2004 of transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies, making it legal in Colombia to use both judicial and extrajudicial mechanisms, and allowing the Prosecutor General the faculty of not having to investigate everything, but to choose and select, which would have been otherwise impossible, and other things. So first, the framework. Then, secondly, the thing for which possibly the negotiation, the process is best known, which is putting victims at the center. Now, 2 words for those who don't know anything about Colombia. I already mentioned the figure of 8 million. There were over 8 million registered victims in Colombia, of which about 7 are IDPs, and about 1.5 million are victims of everything else, including hundreds of thousands of dead, hundreds of thousands literally of kidnapped and forcefully disappeared. This was the longest conflict in the Americas. The FARC was the largest insurgency ever in the Americas, had at one stage up to 20,000 fully armed fighters, plus intelligence, plus everything else. And the timeline is, we had failed negotiations in the 80s, failed negotiations at the beginning of the 90s, failed negotiations at the end of the 90s, at the beginning of the 2000s, major negotiations. We knew we could not fail, so we had to go for what I called incremental approach, starting in 2010, with a back channel, very secret. I handled it myself for the president as national security advisor. Through that back channel, we agreed with great difficulty to have a first phase and start secret negotiations. Took us a year and a half to do that. We started in 2012. And after 6 months, we signed a framework agreement. This was an extremely important move. And based on that framework agreement, the president went public and said, we're doing negotiations again, but this time is on the basis of this framework. It took us 4 years to actually fill it with content to put meat on the bones. But that framework already included point 5 called victims. And this was the first time that victims had been written into a peace agreement. There were important precedents of, for example, in Central America, human rights agreements, truth commissions had been agreed to, but never agreements focused on the rights of victims. And we said that victims were at the central process from the very beginning. This was actually, it took us weeks of secret discussions with FARC, because they obviously understood victims means justice, what is going to happen to us. So once we moved from the secret talks to the, not public, the talks were still confidential, but publicly known talks, once we got to that point, which was the hardest point to negotiate, it took us a year and a half, full year and a half to negotiate this. When we began in June of 14, we said, okay, so how are we going to approach this? So I suggested, why don't we first agree to some principles, some guiding principles to steer us through this thing? And actually, reasonably quickly, we kind of made some suggestions, and they agreed to them. And these principles were actually extremely important, especially the first 2 or 3, which were the first point. Principle number 1 was acknowledgement of the victims. First point, you have to acknowledge the victims as victims. That means whatever you do, they have to have their space. Acknowledgement of responsibility by the perpetrators, number 2. And number 3, the need to address victims' rights to justice, truth, reparations, and non-repetition across the board, which, this is a very important point, gives you a measure of what it is to achieve justice in a transition from war to peace, which is to the extent that you can show that you are actually fulfilling your obligations and addressing these rights in a broad sense. You can say, I am actually truly fighting impunity, even if my sentences in criminal justice terms may sound lenient. You cannot just look at that. You have to look at the whole spectrum, and you can ask then the victims what they actually prefer. And then there was the issue of having victim participation, which was crucially important. Every time we started discussing a point on the agenda in Havana, we would invite some experts to talk, and we would also organize a large conference in Colombia with the help of the UN and of the main public university to bring proposals to Havana. So in the case of the victims, we thought, well, this is too big, because for Colombians, the conflict really meant, above all, victimhood, because it had been going on so long. So we said, we cannot do one conference, we need to do more. So we had 4 major conferences around the country. And all of this information would be gathered and brought to the negotiating table in Cuba. But then we also had this issue of people coming, and then so I said, look, it's ridiculous. We cannot just have the government choose some victims, come here and talk to us, and the FARC choose some victims. That doesn't work. That's not legitimate. So I mean, this is Chatham House. Oh no, it isn't Chatham House. I'm being filmed. Okay. But it's not so serious. So I actually made the suggestion to the Norwegians that, look, why don't we actually invite a large number of victims, like 60 victims, to Havana to come and address us. The Norwegians were facilitators with the Cubans. And so we set up a system whereby we asked the Catholic Church, the UN, and this university to pick 60 victims, and we only gave them criteria along with FARC, which was, your selection has to be pluralistic, it has to be even-handed, representative of types of crime, territory, but you choose. And so we had these delegations of victims, of 12 victims each, start coming to Havana around August of 2014, and it was really the most extraordinary thing, because this was done in a very, very, very large conference room in Havana, kind of modernist cube, and the victims would come in, and on the left there was the government. I will tell you an account of a very good friend of mine, who is actually the guy you're going to see on this video, of this, who's called Leiner Palacio, and I asked him what was his experience like, because he came with the first group of victims to speak, and he said to me, look, when I came into that large room, because we thought this negotiation, nobody believed in this, because they all failed, and when we came into this large room, and we saw the government solemnly stand up, and the FARC in front, and the bishop at the back, with the UN and with these internationals, and everyone standing, and we were at the center of this whole thing. We thought, this is serious, this is real. And it was like having a live truth commission in the middle of a negotiation. They gave their proposals, but mostly they told us what had happened to them, and this became, I always call it the kind of the central fulcrum, the energy, if I may use that expression, almost like the spiritual energy of the whole process became this fact that the victims had participated, and then the victims amongst themselves started talking and recognizing each other in their suffering. And I will make a 10-second pause here to allow myself the following comment, because I've been coming to this part of the world now for a few years, and people ask about negotiations, and you say, well, look, this is so different. But there's one thing I can tell you, actually there's one question I have for you, which is, I frankly don't understand why everyone thinks that the agenda of the Middle East peace process is set in stone, and all you need to talk about is the status of Jerusalem and security and the territories. What about the wrong that was done by all sides? What about the victims? If you do this, you will find that people will recognize each other in their suffering, and you may find, if not a solution, at least more space to discuss such an extraordinarily difficult problem. The next thing we did, and this is a very long story, which was set up this really very complex, comprehensive system to address this broad range of rights. So we set up a special tribunal, which Camilo's part. We set up a truth commission. We set up a special unit to look for the forcefully disappeared, which in Colombia is a very large number, close to 100,000, according to the latest figures. And here's a key move. You say, well, why would the FARC agree to go to a tribunal and acknowledge war crimes? Because we agreed that this was the same system for all, that all perpetrators, including state agents, would go to the system, and it was the same system. And that was the key move that allowed FARC to actually move forward, because they said, we're not going to stand on the stage on our own and acknowledge what we did, and what about everyone else? So this was a critical move. But this actually didn't happen so easily, and this is my next point, which is the importance of what I call turning constraints into enablers. What do I mean by that? I mean, the issue of justice and peace and the tension between justice and peace is a true issue. It's much more serious than a good deal of the transitional justice literature gives it credit for. If you're sitting at a negotiation and the people across from you are some of the FARC secretariat members, therefore responsible for all kinds of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and you have to agree with them to a system, then you have a real problem. But at the same time, if you're creative and you lay out what the constraints are, then those constraints are actually going to help you move towards the acknowledgement of the solution. And then I will show this quick anecdote. So we started with these principles, we started discussing a truth commission, we started having the visits of the delegations of victims, but then at one stage we actually had to discuss the hard issue of criminal prosecutions. So we had a special meeting on that. We would work through cycles of negotiations of 11 days and go back to Colombia, but this was a special session where only Humberto de la Calle and myself went up to Havana, and on our own, with the FARC, no witnesses, we sat down to talk justice in the serious term. And we opened by saying, look, we are signatories of the Rome Statute. That's a fact. We are part of the Inter-American System of Human Rights, which has knocked down all amnesty laws in Latin America in the last few years. This is a fact. We have all kinds of constitutional constraints about pronouncements already of the Constitutional Court, the law. By the way, I told you, and Marcus was sitting in front of me, by the way, you have already about 80 sentences in absentia, and you have 30 whatever. And by the way, above and beyond all of this, the Colombian people expect justice to be done. So there's not going to be any blanket amnesty here. So what are we going to do? Because these are the basic parameters. That's how we started. And Marcus was literally, he had dark Ray-Bans on and he was literally shaking like this. And we had the hardest meeting for about 3 hours. But they were quite relieved in the end. They said, okay, well, finally, government said what they thought. And then we started working at this. And it was very hard. But those were the parameters. And this is why I meant that but why did they agree to this in the end? Because, and this is why it took us so long to negotiate this point, because it was a learning process. It was a process of assimilation. Because it wasn't good enough just for the government to say this, because we were the enemies. You know? So we needed others to say the same thing. So the Norwegians actually supported a group of international lawyers that became known as the New York group, that would come up with ideas and talk to the FARC and basically more and more understand this is actually the way the world now works. And a special commission was set up because it was too difficult to negotiate directly as we had negotiated everything else. And they got some good lawyers, or at least good tacticians, who understood that these were the limits. And we had our own. And we also were talking all this time to the ICC. I was talking personally to Fatou Bensouda in The Hague and in other places, and other people were coming up to Havana, for example, a great Algerian lady, Leila Zerougi, who was then the special envoy of the Secretary General for Child Soldiers. All these people would go up and talk to them until the FARC realized this is actually something we need to do. But then there's an additional element which is extremely important in this kind of thing, which is legal certainty. Legal certainty. I was in Sudan 3 months before, so 3 weeks actually before the fighting started, at a big conference speaking with Albie Sachs, the South African judge, and then I went to see the advisors of the generals who wanted to talk to me. And I said, you have to think about legal certainty, because yeah, you can have an amnesty, but what's the use of an amnesty if you're going to get picked up in Paris in 2 months' time? And so this was actually a pretty convincing argument. Next, for this system to work, you need a system of what we call conditions or conditionalities. So yes, you get a lenient sentence, which in the case of the special tribunal, you hear more about from Camilo, is only 8 years. It's extramural. It has a very strong restorative element. It's designed to kind of dovetail into the peace-building efforts at large. It's a more dignified thing. But in order to get this, you have to, first of all, have disarmed, certified by the UN, certified by the High Commission for Peace that you've been demobilized. You have to tell the full truth. You have to apologize to your victims. You have to guarantee you're not going to take up arms again. And if you do all of these things, this is the deal. If you don't, then you can be prosecuted and get 20 years in prison. And this system of incentives is extraordinarily important for the whole thing to work. And at the same time, next thing you need is a system of guarantees that this is going to hold. This is also extremely important in such war to peace transitions with insurgencies. So we actually had to go to great lengths to pass constitutional amendments that would give a constitutional grounding to the system. As you see, we're extraordinarily legalistic in Colombia, but actually, this thing that looks like you're going overboard turned out to be incredibly important, because the next president had been one of the enemies of the peace agreement. And by the way, for Israeli and Palestinians, it's actually pretty easy to understand Colombia, because we had something very similar to the terrible politics of the 90s, of just kind of this bitter public rivalry. And so those who were against were really against. And the new president really tried to knock down the system, but he couldn't. Why? Because we had embedded it in the Constitution, and we had the Constitutional Court on our side. And there were also other guarantees, such as having a very serious verification mission on the ground, with the UN Security Council mandate, with the Security Council on top of this whole thing, and we actually extended the mandate for them to also verify compliance of the sentences and how that works. And this is something that was finally agreed to and should get going, I hope, at the end of this year. Finally, as I said, war to peace transitions is too large. There are too many victims. And they're only not just direct victims. So our vision was that this whole system, which in itself is already comprehensive, has to be seen as being embedded in a larger agreement, which had these 5 points on rural development, on political participation, on the issue of drugs, but especially that had what we called a territorial approach, so that everything that's happening on this front is complemented by other measures. For example, we agreed to some very ambitious rural development programs in 16 regions of Colombia, about 20% of Colombian territory, which is, I mean, those programs cover what's probably about 5 times the state of Israel, and they have actually, they're not only about doing development, they're about including people, participatory planning, 250,000 people participating in the design of the programs, but they also explicitly have a reparative objective. So they're actually written in also as a form of reparation and recognition of the wrong done. I will stop there because I'm at my 60 minutes. I don't know if we first listen to it, if you think that's worth seeing this video, or whether you want to watch the video first and then whatever it is, or if you.
Let's do the video.
Okay. So thank you. I just wanted to show you this very quickly, because this is about non-state actors, and this is the real thing, which is this photograph is of a church in a town called Bojayá in Colombia. If you've never been to Colombia, you don't even try to imagine it. It's impossible. It's too varied. And the Pacific coast of Colombia has very deep rainforests. In school, one was told that it had the highest rainfall in the world. And it's very sparsely populated, mostly by Afro-Colombians who live really in poverty. And at the time, in 2002, FARC was in the area, and paramilitary units moved in. Paramilitary in Colombian Spanish does not mean what it means in Northern Ireland. It means this kind of right-wing civilian counterinsurgent militias that at their origin had sadly strong links to the military, but actually became more and more autonomous, more implicated in the drug trade, and were a true third actor of the Colombian conflict. like the Loyalists in Northern Ireland, with still discussion about collusion, as we all know. And so they moved in, and the FARC moved into this town and threw a cylinder bomb at this church and killed 80, mostly women and children. Fast forward, this is May of 2002. Fast forward to late December of 2014, the community, with the support of the church, and I think with some UN money, go up to Havana and start talking directly to the FARC and start a process on their own through all of 15, telling them, you need to apologize to us. You need to apologize. And by late 15, everything is ready. So what I'm going to show you now is how, so they organized, the community itself organized all of this. And they organized a ceremony that lasted all the morning. I'm going to show you 12 minutes. And which began by, so I was there as a representative of the Colombian state as High Commissioner for Peace, but it was about the FARC apologizing. Not that we didn't need to apologize about certain things as well. So they showed us the church. Then they did this extraordinary, so today this church has been partly redone, but the priest's house next to it has been left in the state. It was after the bombing destroyed, because actually the whole town a new town was built by the government, because the town was destroyed. So this was used as a kind of theater setting, very dramatic, you'll see it. And they actually did this theater piece that recreates what happened to them with the support of the church, and I think some German people who were around. And then the FARC apologized, a FARC commander called Pastor Alape, and then they had this chants, this Afro-Colombian chants from called Alabaos, which you will see. And they actually cordoned off the whole village with this black plastic on one part and then white plastic on another. And they took in the FARC through the black bit, and they took the rest of us through the white bit, and they organized this whole choreography. And it was filmed, but it wasn't live, and the press was not allowed in. But there was a record, and so last point, when I was ambassador in Colombia and Brussels, as ambassador, you need to celebrate your national day, and I thought, I'm not going to do the usual thing, which is do a little concert. I invited Leonard Palacios, who had led this, to Brussels, and we invited lots of people to a gallery, and we explained what had happened. He talked, and then we showed this video. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do simultaneous translation, because it doesn't have subtitles. And we'll see if it works. If it doesn't, you let me know. So they're reading out the names of the people who died. Perhaps turn off the lights? On. The 2nd of May. Second of May, in this municipality of Bojayá, there were military combat between FARC and paramilitary. They launched. They threw cylinder bombs and they killed at least 79 people, black people. There were amongst which were 48 children. There's a large number of injured, and 1,744 families were displaced.
se iniciaron desde el día 21 de
It
abril
started on the 21st of April
con el desembarque de las tropas paramilitares
as the paramilitary
provenientes
arrived.
de Turbo, pasando por los controles militares y
Went through
policiales
the
del
military
Pago
checkpoints.
Atraco y llegaron a tomar posesión de los pueblos de Vigía y Bellavista.
They took control of the towns of Vigía and Bellavista, Bellavista Bojaya.
Atacó entre finales de abril y comienzos de
And
mayo.
FARC attacked at the end of April.
Señores, grupos armados,
Sir,
no nos causen más dolor.
people from the armed groups don't cause us more pain.
La toma de 2 de mayo y eso quedó para la historia.
The 2nd of May attack is now part of history.
Y a la de la prensa.
And to the people of the press we say, don't erase memory,
La prensa.
don't let memory be erased.
La guerrilla de la FARC hoy quiere pedir perdón.
The FARC guerrilla wants today to come to ask for forgiveness.
Colombianos pedimos que no más repetición.
We Colombians ask for no more repetition.
Según nosotros,
According to us,
son 3 responsables.
there
La
are 3
guerrilla de la
responsible people.
FARC, que siguió el combate en
The FARC,
medio de la población
that
civil
continued the
y lanzó
combat
varias
amongst the
tipetas,
civilians
una de las
and threw a
cuales
cylinder
cayó
bomb,
en la capilla
one which landed on
donde
the
se
church
refugiaban centenares de personas,
with hundreds of people in
todos
it,
civiles.
all
Los
civilians.
paramilitares,
The paramilitary,
por haber tomado a la población civil
for taking
de
the civilians
escudo humano.
in their
El
hands,
Estado colombiano,
and the Colombian
por no
state
haber atendido
for not
las alertas que
responding
oportunamente
to the
se enviaron
early alerts
pidiendo su
which we sent
intervención para prevenir estos
to
hechos.
prevent this.
Como comunidades,
As communities,
quisiéramos
we
que
will
no
wish
estuviéramos aquí
that we
con
weren't
el
here
corazón cargado de tristeza y de
with our
dolor,
heavy hearts,
sino con el corazón henchido de alegría viendo los rostros de esos 48 niños
but
y niñas que
full of joy watching the children that died. This is a theater piece.
Traigan boca, chicos. Tráiganme pescado. Traigan chonte.
Nos colocamos frente
This is Pastor Lape, one of the 7 secretariat members, so this is the top leadership of FARC.
al frente de todas y todos
We
ustedes
start before all of you,
para solicitarles
To ask you-
acepten nuestra disposición
accept our
a
disposition
rendir tributo
to render
y honrar
tribute
la memoria de
and
las
to honor
víctimas
the
que ha
memory of the
producido este
victims
largo conflicto
of the conflict,
al que hemos sido arrastrados por el torbellino de la violencia
To which we were pulled
con
by
actos
the
que no están en el
maelstrom
ámbito de
of
nuestra acción.
violence.
En la conciencia de
In our-
toda nuestra militancia
The conscience of all of us,
sigue vivo el dolor que padecimos
It's the-
hace más de 13
it's still alive, the pain we felt more than 30 years ago,
años
13 years ago,
en esta tierra de olvido y esperanza.
in this forgotten land. Oh, sorry.
Eran tiempos del rompimiento del proceso
It
de
was
paz
when
en el
the peace
Caguán
process was broken in Caguán,
y el inicio de la etapa más violenta
and
de
the
la
beginning of the
confrontación
hardest phase of the
como
war
jamás había ocurrido en nuestra historia.
as has never happened in our country.
Ese fatídico 2 de mayo
That
de
fatal
2002
2nd of May of 2002
estremeció el alma colectiva de nuestra militancia guerrillera.
wrenched the soul of our militants.
Una acción dirigida a proteger a esta población de la arremetida paramilitar
We were trying to protect the
terminó
population from the
hiriéndola
paramilitaries,
profundamente
but we ended up
con
hurting
un
it
saldo letal de 79 compatriotas
with
muertos,
79 Colombians who
que
are dead,
sigue atormentando las
which still
fibras de nuestra sensibilidad colectiva.
torments our collective sensibility.
Las armas que nos tocó empuñar
The weapons we held
con el propósito de defender a los sectores más vulnerables de la
in order to
nación
protect the weakest in our
terminaron
nation
aquí
ended up
lesionando profundamente a nuestros propios padres,
doing damage to our own
hermanos,
parents,
familiares.
brothers, relations.
Familiares y compañeros
Family relations and friends
con inimaginables consecuencias para las familiares
With
de las
un-
víctimas y la
with
comunidad.
unimaginable consequences for the family of the victims and the community.
Episodios desgarradores como los ocurridos
Heart-wrenching episodes
en esta comunidad
as the ones that happened here,
y en la que tenemos parte de
and where we
responsabilidad
have part of the responsibility,
no pueden volver a repetirse.
cannot be repeated.
Hace 13 años
13 years ago,
que pesa en nuestros hombros el dolor
on our
desgarrador
shoulders weighs
que les afecta a todas y todos ustedes.
the heart-wrenching
Hemos
pain that
reconocido el
affects you.
hecho
We have acknowledged the fact,
y reafirmamos un hondo pesar
and we affirm against
por el resultado nunca
our
buscado
deep
ni
sadness for this result.
querido. Cargamos un peso
We carry a weight,
angustiante que hiere el corazón
and-
de toda la guerrilla.
anguishing weight that hurts the heart of all of the
Desde ese
guerrillas
fatal desenlace
since that
que
day,
sigue retumbando en la memoria de todos.
and still echoes in the memory of all of us.
Sabemos que estas palabras,
We know that these words,
como lo hemos manifestado en varias
we've
ocasiones,
said it a number of times,
no reparan lo irreparable,
will not repair what's not repairable.
ni devuelve a ninguna de las personas que perecieron,
When we will not give back to any of the
y
families that died,
tampoco borra el sufrimiento causado.
and will not erase the suffering caused.
Sufrimiento que se refleja en el rostro
Suffering
de
that
todas
is reflected
y
in
todos
the
ustedes,
faces of all of you,
por quienes ojalá algún día
by,
seamos perdonados.
by whom we hope one day will be forgiven.
Estamos frente a ustedes para manifestar nuestra aflicción,
We stand before you
nuestro
to
reconocimiento
express our affliction and our acknowledgement
y afirmación de que este hecho nunca debió ocurrir.
that this should have never happened.
Sabemos que ninguna palabra contiene las emociones que nos invaden
We know
ante
that
la
no words
pérdida de
contain
nuestros seres
the
queridos,
emotions that take
y
over
por
us
ello
before the loss of our loved
enfatizamos
ones,
nuestro dolor por el sufrimiento que les
and therefore
causamos.
we emphasize the pain
Venimos
we caused
impulsados
by the suffering we caused, and we come here moved by
por el compromiso
our
con la
commitment
verdad,
with truth,
reconociendo el daño causado
acknowledging the pain
y
caused
la intención de seguir avanzando
and
por
the
el camino del diálogo
intention to continue to
para
move
resarcir
forward
con
with
acciones
dialogue,
reparadoras
to repair,
y reafirmar nuestro compromiso
and
de
to
no
reaffirm
repetición.
our
Mi cuerpo,
compromise with
especialmente
commitment to
mi
non-repetition.
mente, quedó traumatizada al ver a mis seres queridos destrozados y muertos. Por la noche tengo pesadillas.
I was traumatized at seeing my friends dead and injured. At night, I have nightmares.
Lloré,
I
sufrí,
cried.
cuestioné. Fue un día muy triste y decepcionante.
Very sad day.
Pensé vengarme.
I thought of vengeance.
Recapacité y perdoné.
I thought again and I pardoned.
También sueño con algunas escenas.
I
Veo
remember
venir
some
a la
scenes.
gente.
I dream
Los
about
veo
them.
correr despavoridos.
I see the people
Solo
running.
quien lo vive es quien verdaderamente lo siente.
El río estaba anegado en las casas y los grupos armados atemorizaban.
the river was covered with blood, and the armed groups threatened us.
Cuando pasó todo eso fue terrible.
When everything happened, it was
No
terrible.
teníamos nada que colocarnos y nada que comer.
We had nothing to wear or to eat.
Mi cuerpo estaba lleno de sangre y heridas.
My,
En
bo-
estos 13 años,
my body was covered with
los que
blood.
contamos con suerte de estar vivos, lo llevamos en nuestras memorias.
In this 13 years, those who are lucky enough to have remained alive have kept their memory
Y lo recordamos todos los días de nuestra
and
vida.
remember us every day of our lives.
El dolor es profundo
The pain is deep,
y lo es también
and it's also
para nuestras 32 comunidades
for our
indígenas,
32 indigenous communities,
18 consejos comunitarios
18 communal councils,
ubicados en los ríos que conforman el municipio de Bogotá.
in the rivers around us.
Colombianos pedimos que no más repetición.
We Colombians ask for no repetition.
Hay que construir la paz. Y para construir la paz tenemos primero que
We have to build peace, and in order to build peace,
enfrentar ese pasado que hemos vivido.
we have to face the past we lived
El día de hoy.
today.
El asunto ahora no es simplemente conocer los hechos.
It's a bit funny to translate myself. The issue now is not to know what happened,
Es reconocer.
but to recognize what happened.
Esa es la esencia del cambio. Reconocer
That's the essential
y
of what happened,
asumir
acknowledgement of what
la
happened.
responsabilidad por lo ocurrido. Y no solamente en
And not
Bogotá,
just in Bojayá,
sino en todos los hechos del
but
conflicto.
all the atrocities of the conflict.
La reconciliación es un proceso abierto que por el momento debe iniciar por confrontar la negación de la atrocidad y
Reconciliation is an open process that must begin by confronting those who negate the atrocities
promover el reconocimiento de
and
responsabilidades.
promote acknowledgement of responsibility.
Con esta nos despedimos.
With this one, we say goodbye.
Ya no les cantamos más.
And we will sing no more.
Que se acabe la violencia en el río Boyá.
That violence should end in the Bojayá River.
Que se acabe la violencia, no
What happened on the 2nd of May is now for history. And that memory should not be forgotten or erased.
No sé cómo lo hacen. Pero bueno, tener la oportunidad de...
That was it. That's where I went.
Thank you very much for that, Sergio. I'm gonna,
patience.
no, thank you. That was excellent. Excellent. Talking an excellent video. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. I'm delighted and honoured to do so. It's Roisin McLone. Roisin is also from Belfast, like myself. Roisin is a human rights activist working for peace across the island of Ireland. She has just concluded managing a Peace 4 programme, actually, it was European Union funded, addressing the legacy of violence through facilitated dialogue for the Glencree Peace Centre, and has recently been appointed by the Northern Ireland Executive Office to the Independent Panel for Truth Recovery, which is looking at institutional abuse of children who were in care. Born in Belfast, Roisin has also been involved with conflict transformation programmes in Croatia, Macedonia, Guyana, America and South Africa. She was one of 2 community relation nominees onto the Civic Forum in Northern Ireland. She was an Assistant Boundary Commissioner for Belfast, independent member of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and a board member of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council. Roisin graduated with a Masters in Philosophy and Reconciliation Studies with the Irish School of Economics in Trinity College Dublin. Roisin.
Thank you, Kieran. I mean, how do you follow that? I mean, that's so powerful, Sergio, so powerful, and that's how you do an apology. I suppose the first thing I want to start with is I want to thank Danny, because Danny and Ron came to Belfast over a number of years, and they brought their students with them, and they were very special students, one sitting directly in front of me now. And I don't say that lightly, because of the work that I do. We had visitors from all over the world. We had visitors from Russia, Japan, from all of the Balkan countries, Australia, America. And there was just something special about the students from the Minerva Centre in the Hebrew University. There was just something very special about the groups that came. I think it was about the atmosphere that Danny and Ron created when they were teaching here, but I also think it was about they were very engaged. The students were very engaged, much more engaged than many of the other people that came to visit us. And I'm so privileged to actually get here to Jerusalem, and I'm so delighted to be in Israel. So that's how I start. Sergio, I think actually what I have to say fits very nicely into what you said, because you were in the mud, and I'm sort of what happened next. So I suppose our Good Friday Agreement, which you know happened in 1998, we didn't have victims at the centre of that, and that is an enduring inconsistency and difficulty and conflict that we have in our peace process. But what we did have was we had an agreement which dealt with many issues. It also then sidestepped many issues, and what it also did was set up commissions around many issues. And we had the Sentence Review Commission that was set up for the release of political prisoners. We had all of those issues. We had a peace agreement, and everybody was delighted. And then we had this whole load of men on the ground who had been in the I'm trying to remember the terminology here, Kieran, to keep it consistent, non-state armed groups from both communities that had been murdering each other for 30, 40 years. And then we had an armed police force that actually was from one of the communities and not representative of the other. So we had all of this going on, and it was like, well, what happens now? The peace agreement's done. These men hated one another. They hadn't ever engaged in any sort of a dialogue. Well, I was very fortunate, actually, because the organisation that I took over working for in 1997 had actually been set up by 2 leaders of these non-state armed groups. One of them was a man called Billy Hutchinson, who's still around in Belfast and was elected after the Good Friday Agreement to the Assembly. He represented the UVF, which was a loyalist paramilitary group. And the other one was Pat McGeown. And Pat was a Republican, and he had actually been on hunger strike during the very famous hunger strikes. Absolutely wonderful, two wonderful guys. And 10 years before the agreement, they had identified in a very quiet way, it was all very secret and quiet and confidential, that there needed to be some dialogue between the armed groups, because we were actually never going to get out of the conflict otherwise. You know, it was a stalemate. It was never going to come out. So I took over that group in 97. Now, for the females in the audience, I'll tell you some other time about the difficulties that taking over as I call myself a non-violent combatant. And as a non-violent combatant, I had to take over from a very violent combatant. And run this organisation, which I did then for the subsequent 20 years. So really, I don't normally have notes, but I've kept a few here because I want to give you some quotes. And I think they say some of the issues more succinctly than I do, but it's just at the beginning, don't worry. So I suppose what I want to do today, with that context having been set about what I was working with or who I was working with, I want to talk a bit about the context of the interfaces and the walls and what we were facing, and fear, mistrust and memory. I want to talk a wee bit about contested space and that is the whole issue of parades and flags. I then want to move on to what we did, which was about building trust, and that's really about making and keeping agreements in a divided society. And then I want to give you some examples of the work we did, and then I want to talk about 3 distinct and specific trust-building processes that we were involved in. So just very briefly in terms of the fear, mistrust and memory. So these walls that we have are not unlike the walls that you see at the West Bank, but we have many more. Yours are much more continuous than ours. And these were set up in 1969 when the Troubles broke out. They were set up as a temporary measure to stop people attacking each other from the different communities. But they became a permanent feature and actually became architectural features of Belfast. And in all, I think we probably have about, now, when I say this number, don't get too panicked, because some of them are maybe only a couple of, maybe 30 yards wide, but there's about 72 different small walls and fences and gates. And the organisation I worked for, because of the nature of what we did and because we were working with armed groups, our offices were right bang in the middle of those walls and working in those walls. And what we did was, it was set up to look at dialogue between the two groups, but also to try and encourage the communities, because the armed groups were very embedded in the community. It wasn't like rural districts. These were people that lived, they were your next door neighbour. And if they showed the leadership for dialogue across those communities, well, first of all, other people didn't have to do it, right? And secondly, it showed the example of that it could be done. So these interfaces really, I suppose, they were the demarcation lines between one community and another. But they had been the complete focus for sectarian violence and murder. That's what they were known for. And I suppose I would call them our killing fields. And within this, it cultivated a culture of fear and mistrust, obviously. For those on the other side of the wall. I mean, Danny, I'm delighted that Danny brought to your attention that this is on our international wall. Our international wall is a part of this wall where 2 artists, depending on current issues in the world, change the murals every couple of months. And it reflects. It's on a peace wall. The international part of it is mainly on the nationalist side, but it does go up a bit into the other side. But they were called peace walls, and we that worked in this work really felt that was the most ridiculous thing we ever heard of, because there was nothing peaceful about these walls at all. So what we tried to do was we tried to change the parlance, and we called them interfaces. So I'm going to refer to them as interfaces because that's what I believe they were. They were the interface between communities. So they became central to. There was this dichotomy because they were there and people felt in some senses secure because the wall was there. But then the other side of that was the proximity to violence. And let me just tell you a wee bit about that. And I suppose just before I tell you about that, what they also were the micro manifestations of the macro political war. That's what they were in that part of Ireland. And they became the symptom of much deeper divisions. But Pete Charlow and Brenton Murda in the University of Ulster in research, they discovered that 70% of Troubles-related murders took place less than 50 yards from an interface, okay? And these walls that had been set up to protect people, actually 85% of the killings in the conflict, or the overall killings in the conflict, occurred 1,000 yards from these walls. So the nearness of the killing to people's homes, it created really, we worked in a population that was obsessed with the violence and obsessed with the Troubles. And that was the environment that we worked in. And the other thing that I will say is that they were a constant reminder of the harm that was done, but also the threat implied. So there always was the potential for violence to break out. And the other point that I would make here is that violence on your doorstep leaves a very lasting imprint, and the geography of the violence and the power of its memory. It's still alive now, and it's still keeping people segregated now. So I'm just not going to talk about the parades because I could talk about that forever. It took up such a big part of my life. But I'm going to give you a quote from Dominic Bryant, in his book Orange Parades, The Politics of Ritual, Tradition and Control. And he said, "Orange parades are political rituals which reveal the nature of relations between Protestant Catholic communities in Ireland. They also expose key political divisions within unionism and the relationship of the Protestant community to the British state." So put that in your pipe and smoke it, can you imagine? So that's the context, and now I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we were involved in. So years after I was doing this work, I came across a philosopher called Hannah Arendt, and she talks about the implications of us living together and amongst other people. And she said that the meaning of our lives to some extent are determined by what others do. And she said, yet we still have the freedom to act, which can be self-serving or altruistic. And she identified that we can only create our future together by making and keeping promises to each other. Okay? But this was the bit that really got me. She identified 2 dilemmas associated with this, which make us vulnerable. Life is irreversible and cannot be replayed to change hurt or harm that has been caused to others. And secondly, life is unpredictable and we cannot know with certainty either what is ahead of us or how others will feel or act towards us. And when I was studying, I was a mature student, I remember that really jumped out at me, and I thought, you know, she said that the only way to navigate through these challenges was to make and keep promises to one another. And I suddenly realised that's what we do. That's what building trust is. That's about saying to people, what do you agree? How do I agree to treat Sergio? How does he agree to treat me? And me to keep my word and him to keep his word. And I realised that that was the context in which, now this was in the after I had been doing the work. So I suppose what we started with was we started to build the capacity of the communities. We started to build, because there's nothing worse in any dialogue where one community either acts or feels superior to the other. So we started to build capacity within those communities and within those armed groups. And we built that capacity so that when people came together, they came together as equals. And we did that initially. And then slowly we started to move in. We talked about social and economic issues, but slowly we started to move into the area of de-escalation of violence. And it was actually, it all sounds very serious, but actually it was very good crack, because crack is C-R-A-I-C, right? Okay.
It's not a drug.
So it was actually very good crack, because what we did was we got these guys coming together that were all sides were Christian, they were white. There was mirror reflections in each of the group of each other. They liked the same music. They grew up in the same generation, and they had been trying to murder each other. And I remember on many occasions they would be anecdotal, you know, they talk and they would say, "Do you remember that time I tried to kill you? How did we get away with not getting in?" The guy said, "Well, I went up into the attic and hid there against the wall." And I used to sit thinking, God, you know, if this wasn't so serious, it would be hilariously funny. But they started to build trust and build relationships. It was very difficult to begin. At the beginning, they actually said to me, "We'll come to that meeting," and I'm sure you can identify this, Sergio, as well, "but we're not going to talk to them. We'll talk through you. We'll talk through the chair. We won't actually engage with them." But we ended up that we had these guys, and it was just they were mirror images of each other in those communities. So we built that trust, built the capacity, and then we started to talk about how do we stop the violence. And how we stopped it was we started to realise that what would happen very often would be, it wouldn't be the armed groups, or it wouldn't be activists that were out engaging in throwing stones across the walls. The problem was, if you're on the other side of a wall and a stone comes across, you don't know who threw it. So your imagination takes over and you immediately go, it's the other community attacking us. It may be 3 15-year-olds or 3 10-year-olds throwing stones across. So we developed a network, and what we did was it was only the introduction of cell phone technology, and people would go to the places where the violence was, and they would stop the young kids and they would stop the escalation. So we de-escalated the violence. And then we started to, how am I doing for time here, Kieran?
You're doing okay.
So then we got the mobile network together, and what that consisted of, there would be a laminated card, and there would be all the list of phone numbers for all the different areas. So if you needed to talk to someone from another area, at the beginning, people would be really nasty to one another on the phone, and you're attacking us and, whatever. But slowly but surely, relationships started to build in. I'm going to jump ahead a wee bit here, but I did realise when we had really achieved trust, and there had been one night there'd been some violence at one of the gates, and it was on the news, and one of the women came in from into our meeting, and she said, "What happened last night? Nobody phoned me. What happened? What happened last night?" And one of the guys from the Republican side said, "Oh, Scilla, don't worry about it. That was a couple on our side. They were partying last night and they got too much to drink and they went up to the wall to agitate." And one of the guys from the other side said, no, that was our fault. That was a couple from our community that did that." And I suddenly thought, we've done it. We've done it when people take responsibility, because up until then it was what you did. It was what you did. It was always about that. So I remember sitting in that meeting and thinking, I don't need to attend these meetings anymore. I can let some of my staff attend these meetings from now on, because we had reached that Rubicon. So that was the mobile phone network. That was the de-escalation of violence. And then what occurred to us was that what would happen sometimes when we had some of the armed groups, sorry, they weren't armed when they were doing this, but when they went to stop the violence, sometimes some community member would have informed the police, and the police would turn up and they would make matters worse, because they would either arrest the guys because they were known members of armed groups, or the kids would start throwing stones at them because the police were the attraction for children of practicing their throwing skills. And slowly but surely it started to occur to me, and at this stage the Republicans wouldn't even dream of talking to the police, wouldn't even think about it, wouldn't even consider it. But it occurred to me, and I was thinking, we really, if we're going to do this stuff, we're going to have to find some way of engaging, because the unionist community were engaging, the Republicans weren't. We're going to have to find some way of engaging. And then we got on to the parades issue, and we started to look at flags protocols. So flags would fly all year round, and they would be mainly on the loyalist side, I have to say, but there will be a proliferation of flags. And I keep telling people this, and I know it's very hard for you to believe, but as well as the traditional paramilitary flags and British flags on the Unionist side, and sometimes tricolours, Irish flags on the Republican side, there would be a proliferation of Israeli flags on the Protestant side and Palestinian flags on the Republican side. And nobody was really quite clear where that started. But to this day, I'm walking through Jerusalem going, oh, because it actually signifies areas where normally I wouldn't feel safe. So sorry, that's just anecdotal. But it's really bizarre. And even during the World Cup, people will pick countries that are either Catholic or non-Catholic. It's absolutely, it's actually grotesque, right? It really is grotesque, but you have to have a sense of humour about this as well, right? So I'm being triggered here every day. There's an Israeli flag. There's an Israeli flag. But anyway, so there were these proliferation of Israeli flags, Palestinian flags, tricolours, UVF. And the loyalist groups have about half a dozen flags. They have the Ulster Volunteer flag, they have the UVF flag, they have the Ulster flag. And it became very, very uncomfortable for people because they would go up along these walls. So we did a flags protocol. I can talk about that in more detail, anybody wants to know, but we started it with, well, look, instead of them being all year round, could we sort of get them to particular times of the year? And I remember, I don't know if any of you know the history, King Billy, this is all predated the 1690 when there was a Dutch king that had very little to do with us, had come across and done a battle. And I remember one of the loyalist guys saying to me, you don't realise that this is a ridiculous statement that he made. He said, but King Billy basically came up this road. He was nowhere near the north of Ireland, but people put their flags up because they believed that this king had been on the road. Anyway, but we managed to get it down to time. And then after a while, we did get people to acknowledge that it was intimidatory, and we started to then have no flag zones, which was a great achievement. But that was just an example of things that came out of that trust building and the parades. We were the first, the Springfield Parade, the White Rock Parade, was one of the first peaceful parades that we did. And where we got there, it's another whole session. Probably Danny and Ron and you would know more about it than anybody else in this room. But that took us 3-4 years to actually get. And recently, so in this White Rock Parade, the Orange Order would come to this gate that was only opened once a year, and the gate would open, and round about 1,000 guys with flags and things and bands and whatever would walk through and walk up through a Catholic area. And then what would happen would be the police would facilitate that because they just wanted to get it through as quick as possible. And then what would happen was once those guys went off for their drink and went off for their cup of coffee and then went to their homes, violence would break out in those areas, and the nationalists would then attack the police because they facilitated this parade through the area. Meanwhile, the guys that had walked through who weren't from the area are all gone home, right? And we would have maybe, and I mean, I saw some of those riots lasting 2 weeks. People would be injured, people would be hurt, homes would be damaged, and we had to find a way around it, so we did. And what would happen would be the army. The army would be drafted in, and those areas would be clamped down on before the parade. So they would go door to door and they would ask how many people live in this house. And people had to say how many people lived in the house because then they were afraid of people coming in from the outside. They would be completely put a ring of steel around that area just to get a 10-minute parade up the road, right? Well, it lasts longer than 10 minutes. So we worked on that and between the armed groups, and we came to a number of different agreements, and it was incremental. So each year we would introduce peaceful protest, and for the first time we introduced a protest where it was women only, and they were allowed right up to the gate. Before that, people were not allowed anywhere near this march, even though they lived. I mean, we are talking about a street with houses there and houses there, and people weren't allowed in their gardens. The tiny gardens at the front, people weren't allowed. And we negotiated that a group of 40 women would walk up to the gate they would be in complete silence, and they would have non-sectarian banners. And one of my administrators came up, there was BT was a telephone company at the time, and they used to, the Orange Order and the Bands Forum refused to talk to the residents, so we were doing this through the armed groups. But there was a BT, which is British Telecom, and they had a logo that they used in their advertisements, and it was, "It's good to talk." So the women made this massive banner that said, "It's good to talk," and stood across the road. And then incrementally each year, we would have more protesters, and then what we actually did was we got to the stage where we could have protesters on each side of the road. So it was very uncomfortable for the parade to have to walk through these women and residents all standing glaring at them, and they were literally, and I remember we get very excited when we're talking about this stuff, as Kieran said earlier, and I speed up, but I remember that at times, the first time that we did it, and it was both sides of the road, I can remember thinking, I can't breathe. And I didn't breathe till that parade came out, walked up that road, and the tail end of it went. But you know what it did? It gave a dignity back to that community. It gave an absolute total dignity. And Kieran's given me the thing, so I'm going to move on. That was the parade. By the way, can I just tell you, the White Rock Parade last year, we had great fun with this. There was 2 police officers on bicycles. That was the total security for the White Rock Parade last year. We then did, I'll move very quickly because it is important to know that we did very structured, very bespoke trust building processes. Brian Curran, a dear friend of mine and mentor from South Africa, human rights lawyer, he's been involved in the Basque Country negotiations. dear friend of mine agreed back in the day to work with me. And what we did was we took the leaders of the groups along with some political leaders to South Africa, and we did a very bespoke peace-building process. And then what we did when we came back a few months later, we brought the foot soldiers together with those leaders, it was Spike and Twister and whatever, brought those foot soldiers together, and we did trust-building processes for a week. The important thing to remember about this is what we did was we did action plans out of those processes, so that over the following 2 years at 3 monthly intervals, we actually monitored what we had agreed, and things would change and we would get a bit braver and do other things. So we did that. So that was the trust. And then the final trust building process was, think about it. So we had the cops doing what the cops were doing, both in terms of disorder and in terms of the parades. And the Republicans don't talk to them. And the loyalists were their surrogate. We'll pass messages for you. And I'm saying to the Republicans, who are very quite intelligent men, you could be doing this directly. This is ridiculous that you're letting loyalists speak for you to the police. So slowly but surely, we developed a policing in partnership project. And that was where I would be the conduit initially. So I would deliver messages back and forward from the Republican community to the police. And that went on for probably about 6 months, 9 months. And then I persuaded a very brave Republican to meet with the very brave police officer. And we did that at a local level. And then we were very fortunate that Fjord, who was our chief constable at the time, supported everything we were doing. And him and I got to know each other very, very well. And he said, go for it, Roisin. He said, don't worry about all of the family in the background. Don't worry about all the political sensibilities. You do what you need to do. And we set up a process which culminated in literally the month after Sinn Féin signed up to the police instructors. We were able to publicly hold 19 separate workshops with senior police officers and senior Republicans, because we had everything ready and we'd done all the preparation. So that was that Policing and Partnership Project. I have a whole PowerPoint presentation on that. I could have spent the whole of today doing that. So I suppose in conclusion, never underestimate the power of people on the ground. That's what I would say to you.
Thank you both. Two fabulous presentations, I think you would agree. So who wants to get in first? I have some questions. I think Danny, I'm going to take them probably in groups of 3, so we'll start with Danny and then Michelle.
So, Roisin, feel free to say no. I just wanted to ask, last night you told me a story that I didn't know about of
the Ardoyne parade?
An event, yes, that was a turning point in the parade. So
well, it was a turning. We had been working for a very long time on the whole parade issue. So it was almost a last straw. And what happened was, I was appointed as a member of an independent member of the policing board. And coming from a Republican background and having a Republican family, that was a big step for me. But anyway, it was making the police accountable, so I did it. And about a month after I'd appointed for my first term, we were monitoring a parade in Ardoyne, because what had happened was when we were working in Springfield, we'd introduced the protocols and whatever. And then people from Ardoyne would say, well, can we borrow your banner, for example? It's good to talk, and could you tell us, walk through? So we were monitoring, and I was with a friend of mine who's actually an Irish government official. And there was a man, so the parade in Ardoyne had gone through, and shortly afterwards, the area is usually closed down and it's a no-go area, but one of the members of the Orange Order, who had been agitating for a number of months, a man called Augie, he had been agitating for a number of months to get this particular parade, which had been banned for quite a long time, and then eventually got up. He had been agitating for a very long time about this. He drove through the crowd and he drove into members of the Nationalist community, which were waiting on the road. The parade was nowhere near the place. He was wearing his band uniform and he had his insignia and he had his window down and he had his arm out, so it was really agitating. Unfortunately, he ran me and a number of other people over. I went over the bonnet of his car, he got both my arms broken, and a young woman got trapped underneath. She was about 17, Phoebe Clausen. And Phoebe got her pelvis broken, her sternum, or both legs, and whatever. And the police, it was horrendous. The police actually had to lift the car off her. And they took him out of the car because the crowd had just... A friend of mine, Rory, who was with me at the time, he's written a poem about it, and he talked about it was like starlings, you know, when starlings move together. The crowd, when they checked that we were okay, had just moved down the road like starlings, and the police surrounded him. And I still have these images in my head, and they lifted the car, which was a massive car. It was a big people carrier, off young Phoebe. And I think after that, because lots of people from that community know me, and I think after that it was like, is this really worth it anymore? We were coming to the dying embers of the parading thing anyway. And that was a turning point for a lot of people for the Ardwine, which was the last bastion of the parades dispute. And that happened in 2015. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Richard. I've got two blokes here on my right hand side and another bloke with a hand up, so good, excellent. And non-blokes hands, okay. So take yourself and yourself. I'll come back to you because I want to get some non-blokes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you first of all for the insightful conversation. I wanted to know from you, Sergio, gender-based violence is often a forgotten component of conflict which impacts women disproportionately, and Colombia is one of the exemplar cases of where it was really integrated within the peace negotiations. And since you said it was victims-focused, the talks, I'm curious to know from you personally, how do you look on 7 years later of how the transitional justice process has addressed the gender-based violence component, also maybe how it also transformed Colombian society since then?
Okay, can I take two more? So that's the gender-based violence question to Sergio, yourself, yeah? And then I'm going to go over here for your question, okay?
Thank you very much to both of you. I mean, it was very interesting and moving also. A bit of a follow-up to the previous question to Sergio. If you can reflect more generally about what has happened since the signature of the agreement to this part, in particular, what has happened to these very vulnerable Afro-Colombian populations on the Pacific? Are their lives better off? Are they suffering less violence, less displacement, less disappearance? Thank you.
Okay, so front row, the end here.
Thank you. My English is not that good, but I'm going to try. My first question is for Sergio. You can say no, but I'm curious about if you were expecting the results of the plebiscito, and yes, how was that for you? And the second question is, I work in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, in the Amnesty Chamber, and also in the Gender Commission. I've been hearing all of you talking about amnesty, apologize, recognition, and it reminds me like the day-by-day work at the jurisdiction, and I was wondering if you can, the three of you can, like, give me your opinion about this thing. In the Amnesty Chamber, we don't have space for apologizing from the combatants. We only have a little, little process for hearing their truth. This is like a judicial truth, different than the Truth Commission. But they don't apologize. You know what's the limit of the Amnesty Chamber, know the worst crime and crimes against humanity, but we also hear victims, and they can hear the interviews that we do to the combatants. Usually they, for example, in extortions, they don't say that they are, like, how do you say, arrepentidos? Like they're not regret about what they did. So they say that we were asking you for contribution, and people know that that was for the good of the cause. So that is like for one side, like from the Amnesty Chamber. But on the other hand, from Gender Commission, I can see like the big cases. We're waiting for the opening of case number 11, which is crimes based on gender, including sexual violence. And we have seen that it's going to be really hard, maybe impossible, to have recognition from the combatants. So I want to know your opinion on how those cases, which is different from the type of crimes, can affect the transitional process in Colombia.
I think it looks to me like I'm going to come back. I'm going to finish this round. Those three questions are probably all to Sergio, and maybe I wouldn't mind chipping something in on one of them. But can I ask Rushing a question myself, just to get some balance in terms of the questions? So Rushing, this is just something, as Sergio is answering, you can let this marinate. And so my question is this. Like yourself, I've been working with armed groups for 30 years. And sometimes the criticism that I would have faced for when we were working with the IRA around establishing community restorative justice was, and this criticism sometimes would have been addressed by a mutual friend of both of ours, who I think loves us both dearly, but sometimes this particular friend, who's a journalist who shall remain anonymous, would say, what you're doing in that kind of work is that you're privileging the armed groups, that actually you are playing into the existing power relationship that they have in terms of their, and so by that focus, the focus of the kind of work that we were doing and the kind of work that you were doing, Russian, that you're playing into privileging the armed group within the community. So anyway, let that one marinate, and you can answer that, and I'll be fascinated to see what you say about it. Sergio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just say that before we end, I would actually like to ask you both a question.
I want to ask you a question later.
which has to do actually a little bit with what it was just that it was asking each other questions. So, on the issue of gender-based violence, well, first of all, we were very conscious of it, and there's a fair amount of language about that in the peace agreement, both with relation to the special jurisdiction for peace and the Truth Commission, also because what happens in places with very long conflicts is that truth is always problematic for all the well-known reasons, but also that a lot of this stuff is already known. So you wonder, okay, what's the added value of doing this? Because actually everyone knows what happened, or think they do, but not everything. Not everything. So, for example, gender violence is one of the things that was not well known, and we were very conscious of this and tried to emphasize it. And then the other thing that happened in the negotiations is that about halfway through, we agreed to set up something that we call the Gender Commission, where some members of the government and some members of the FARC, with some external advisors, would sit down and they would actually first review what we had agreed to till then from a gender perspective, and gender was used in the standard way it is today, so it's not just issues to do with women, and they would make recommendations. But this actually ties in with the question I was asked about the plebiscite, because the hard right used this against us, and the evangelicals said we were trying to pervert children, kind of Trumpian argument, but it was quite successful. So that's actually what happened during the negotiations. Now, and also we had extremely famous Colombian, but who by complete coincidence writes today an op-ed in the main newspaper, whose name I just escaped who was a journalist who was a victim of gender violence in a very notorious case in Colombia, actually writes today asking HEP, special jurisdiction, to get going and open this case on gender violence. So what I see is that they've actually taken their time, and I don't have an explanation for why they've taken so long. So these guys will be better at answering that. But no, it is a very serious issue. On the question of what's happened since the signing of the agreement, so the picture is very mixed in Colombia, and so if you think about the various strands of the agreement, or the kind of 5 points that it has, substantive points. So the point about DDR, it really was a kind of textbook
DDR process. FARC demobilized and disarmed in 8 months with strict supervision. I was actually responsible for this from the government side. We had massive amounts of intelligence on how many people they had, what kind of weapons they had, the numbers, and it all matched very closely. So that went very well, and reintegration on the whole has gone pretty well, demanding because they want to do some collective projects, which is always more difficult. But there have been some pretty serious security issues, especially in the areas where there are still, because the coca economy has subsisted, so that that creates its own vacuum and its own kind of violence. But that's worked well. The strand on legal, legislative reform and the transitional justice bit, it's on the whole I think it's worked very well. People want quicker results like this issue of gender, but actually it's a massive effort. With some asterisks. For example, we created a special unit to look for the disappeared, and I don't say it's publicly much, but they haven't got as many results as they should have done. By the way, I did mention this, but your interest. FARC demobilized, so former FARC created a kind of their own unit for the people that they disappeared themselves. This was a CBM we agreed to at the end of the negotiations. Towards the very end of the negotiations, I mean, CBMs are complicated, I don't need to talk about that. But we actually agreed to a few of them. And one included demining. So, for example, the FARC have actually set up their own organization to demine. And one of the very likely sentences that will be served for those FARC men have to do with demining, and which actually I've always been in favor of, because it's also a good question. If people think, they're getting the soft things. So you think it's a soft thing to go around Colombia to demining the place? Anyway, but so in that context, we also started working with the ICRC and FARC to look for the disappeared, for the obvious reasons that they have still massive amount of knowledge, and because the FARC kidnapped so many people, and this really hurts. I mean, there's nothing worse than forced disappearance. It is the worst crime of all, because the family just live with this. So, so the FARC actually did this, but the unit that we set up, modeling it on the experience of Bosnia and things, hasn't actually become very bureaucratic, and they haven't produced brilliant results. On the whole, transitional justice is good. What's really the kind of missing piece was everything to do with the kind of territorial thing, the rural reform, the investments. So on the whole, in the areas of Colombia where there was no coca or no sort of entrenched organized crime, we have kind of true post-conflict, little difficulties, but fairly well. But actually what you hear more of is the violence that has grown from, there's splinter groups of FARC, but they're really, I mean, they're not really, it's quite similar to Northern Ireland, but worse. And actually, an insurgency is a system, it's a machine. So you only need a few former mid-level commanders to decide to do something. But they're actually not a new FARC, because they're not fighting the government. They are kind of running the drug trade. And then you get the same problems of territorial control. They kill people, they kill former combatants. So that's actually security situation on the whole at the moment, given what it should be, is not good, or is actually in some regions pretty bad.
Afro-Colombian question here.
So the Afro-Colombian communities, like this ones, were particularly isolated, and they live, the Pacific is the main route of the cocaine trade out of Colombia. Goes out to the Pacific, up along Central America to the US. And it's extraordinarily difficult to control, because you have all kinds of rivers, and you have this kind of... And so their situation is not good. This is sadly the truth. Very quickly on the issue of, so we had to, for those who don't know, some people will say we're foolish enough, but I don't think so. But still, so we had agreed that at the end of the agreement, because it was such an ambitious agreement and it touched on so many things, that we would have a popular referendum. as was done in Northern Ireland. But the gods were against us, and this actually happened almost exactly in the middle between Brexit and Trump's election. And I mention that because there's a kind of narrative continuity of the kind of arguments that were made for Brexit and were made in Colombia, and it was kind of the mood of the times. And the gods were against us because things happened, like there was a kind of small hurricane-like storm in the northern coast of Colombia that was very actively pro-agreement, and so the voting was low, and people got too confident. And I was quite nervous, and I thought that we were taking this for granted, and it wasn't obvious. I actually said it on the record the day before, and we ended up losing by 0.3%, by 60,000 votes out of 13.5 million. So that was a really serious crisis, the biggest of all. But actually, once you've been in the things, quick anecdote, I was flying back to Havana with Humberto Lacalle to talk to FARC about what we're going to do, and a Norwegian diplomat asked if he could come along, and it was called Dag, and I said, Dag, I'm actually worried that I'm not more worried, because this is so serious, but we've had so many crises. And now I actually think this whole thing would have collapsed. Yeah. So what we did was establish this system of going to the guys who opposed it. Actually, I'd be very curious to hear if anybody in Israel sort of actually looked at this, because the atmosphere really was similar to what you see in documentaries about 1995 in Israel, and the kind of marches and the bitterness of the opposition. With the difference that here you could see more the kind of factual grounding and the real differences, or whatever you want to call them, vision, ideology. Whereas in our case, it was much more political, but the tactics were quite similar, and the way that Uribe behaved and the way that Netanyahu behaved in the 90s was actually quite similar. And so we had to actually negotiate first with them. So we said, okay, you won, so what are we going to do? What do you suggest? Because they actually didn't say we should break the negotiations, whatever they said. We want changes, modifications was the word. So we sat down and said, okay, just give me your list. So we actually worked with them through weeks and came up with a list of what we thought we could bring to the negotiator, and then went back and negotiated in kind of full speed. And in about a month and a half, we actually had a modified agreement. And but then it really wasn't possible to do a new referendum for all kinds of reasons. The whole thing has been too traumatic. So it was brought before Congress, and Congress voted on it, and sort of, it has a legitimacy problem because people say, "Oh, where do we get it?" That's what happened. Yeah.
Question. So that's the plebiscite question. A question on apologies. It was a technical question about the lack of a capacity for apologies in the amnesty bit, or.
Missing apologies for some crimes and non-recognition for other, which I know that transitional justice is about prioritization and selection, but in the amnesty chamber it's about other type of crimes, but we also have victims there, which there are not the space for them to hear the combatants apologizing for what they
And you think there should be, basically, is that the question?
So I want to...
In one sentence explain, because it's a little bit baroque, everything we do in Colombia legally. But so the main entry point to have is for those who've committed very serious crimes, and they go to this, let's call it truth chamber. Those guys apologize to the victims. But then the kind of lower level crimes, that are the ones that can be amnestied. They go there. So the problem is that there's not an equivalent system set up for them.
Yes, because there are 3 different chambers. The amnesty chamber, the chamber for the military, and the chamber of truth and recognition.
Okay.
So,
I'll give you 20 seconds, my own personal view on that, and this might differ, I suspect, from what Sergio was saying. My own view is that apologies to be considered legitimate, and they have to be voluntary. Is my view.
Can I just comment on that as well and say that what victims have said to me over and over again, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's gender-based violence or not, is they say that the former armed groups want to talk about the political reasons why the atrocities were carried out, and the victims want to talk about the personal cost. and I think that's one of the real difficulties that we have in our process, that there hasn't been very many successful projects to deal with that, because it's almost like, you know, the armed groups, they have a code of conduct, and the code of conduct in some cases actually they can't apologise, because if they apologise then it would invalidate some of their purpose.
I think there are ways around it.
But Kieran, just on the gender-based thing that you asked as well, you know, I don't think we do the gender-based thing very good. There's quite a famous case where there isn't even an acknowledgement that people were abused, you know. So we don't, what I'm saying is you're not unique. That I don't think any of us have found a way around. And I mean, Kieran mentioned that I'm on this I'm on this panel now to look at issues around gender in the past, dealing with the legacy of gender, and I'm not speaking for that panel now because it's just started and I don't represent it here. But you know, the issues and the dilemmas that are there, I think will take a lot more thinking through.
Rusheen, what about the criticism that
I know who you mean. I know
the privileging of armed groups and.
Well, there's just a couple of things I would say. First of all, I didn't come to this work lightly, and I had quite a number of I suppose you would call it crisis of conscience around it, and I had to challenge myself because I come from a Republican background, and one of the difficulties was I was looking at the group from the other side, you know, the loyalists, and I was saying, like, how could I ever work with those guys? You know, they killed friends of mine. They killed a 10-year-old friend of mine, you know, when I was 10, shot him dead and took him away and put a hood over his head and stuff. And after a while, I suddenly realised that it was quite a stark revelation to think, well, actually, if you want to consider it, I don't consider it now. My side did just as bad things. I mean, shooting young people in the knees and, you know, atrocities. You know, we were all culpable in the war. So I didn't come to it lightly, but there's some truth in what he says. But I don't think I mean, how could I, as a woman, Irish woman in Belfast, give legitimacy to armed groups any more than they already have? So that's my answer to that.
Okay. Fair enough. I'll take another round. Yourself, you've been very patient. And then Yael, and okay, I got 4 and 3 other women. Excellent.
Roshan specifically spoke about the fact that the different sides did have cultural, they were culturally basically very much the same, and that certainly helped. Sergio was dealing with Colombians, though I noticed in the video that the FARC people were more or less white, I think, and the natives or the victims in that of the church or that community were colored. However, they were all Colombians. My question, in view of what I've just said, what do you do when you have a situation in which the two sides are very different culturally? And of course, I'm referring to our particular situation here in Israel.
Okay, so yourself, yeah. Then I'm going to take. Oh, that was the same question, right, Yael? So here in the next row, Yael. Second row, yeah.
Thank you. First, thank you for your knowledge and your courage and your personal commitment, and we have so much to learn from you. So both internally and externally, both the big questions and the small questions, as you know. I'm interested in the dynamics and the role between international actors and domestic actors. You're both, the three of you are actually domestic actors. One word about international actors and then a question about domestic actors. So international actors, actually, Roisin, what you said about the Israel and Palestinian flags and within, you know, the difference between empathy and symbiosis, and we have a Greek expert here, so, you know, empathy is sort of feeling together with the other, and then you can help. And symbiosis is sort of going down into the mud with the other, and you know, you're in the mud there, so it's very difficult to sort of pull someone out of the mud. So that, so thank you for that. And I think each international actor in any conflict should sort of do her own sort of retrospect to understand what we're bringing in when we enter, in order to help the most possible and work with empathy and not with symbiosis. A question about the local. What do you think? Who are the local actors who can create change, and what do they need? Not only their opinions or where they're based in the whole spectrum of, in the political field, etc., but what skills do they need in order to carry through? Thank you, and create change.
Okay, front row.
Yeah, I also have a question about Northern Ireland, and in the context of Brexit, what do you see are the implications or consequences of Brexit on communities and community relations today?
Good question. Okay, who wants to go first? Please.
In terms of the international actors, you're absolutely right. I've done some UN stuff, and it never ceases to amaze me how sometimes, particularly, I'm sorry if there's any Americans here, but how Americans go in with an agenda almost, as opposed to it really should be about local actors, and it really should be about what needs to happen in here. And that's not to say they don't do good. I mean, I've been in Croatia and Macedonia, and Liberia, and I've seen some of the good that they do, but at the same time, it wouldn't have worked in Northern Ireland. And that's sort of, the question is almost linked, because what we don't need is, what we certainly didn't need was anyone parachuting in to do work with us. And I remember at one stage when I was at school, when I was in secondary school, a number of very active girls got together and wanted the UN to come in to the north. But I'm just saying, so what we didn't need, and I'll just, no time short, so I'll answer a couple of things in one. I think you need tenacity. I think you need processes, because there's I use a model, a very simple model for dimensions of success. And if you look at dimensions of success in terms of a triangle, and the triangle, at each corner of the triangle, you measure three things when you're looking at success, and one is that relationships are maintained and are robust. That's one side of the triangle. The other one is that you have good, solid processes that you can replicate. And then the third one is that you have results. And if you don't have one of those three, your success is limited. But if you have the three and you keep your eye on the three things, so that to me is what's needed, is that robust, relationships, looking after those, looking after your processes so that you can replicate. And you must have results, because otherwise people won't continue to work and engaged with the processes.
Roisin, will you pick up the Brexit question, and then I'll say something very quickly, and then I will let Sergio finish off.
Brexit has just, I've heard of people, I try not to use military symbolism, but I've heard of people saying it's like just throwing a hand grenade into the whole Irish question. And I remember at the time, because it was so ethereal, it was out there, it was really not. I think two things I'd say very, very quickly. One is, Brexit has thrown everything up in the air in terms of the Irish question, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the determination of Ireland as a nation, united or otherwise. But I think that's inevitable. But what I would say is, I think I'm worried that we have not learned the lesson, that if you go into a referendum not telling people what it is they're going to get.
This is a referendum on United Ireland.
Yeah, sorry, if you go into any referendum, but particularly, I'm absolutely, I'm really worried that on this island, I was going to say, we're not even in Ireland, on our island, that people will not have learned the lessons of Brexit. Because if you go into something, when going back to to Kieran's, how does a committee design a horse? Well, it's a camel. We'll end up with something that will cause further conflict down the road, further generations of conflict. So that's the two things about Brexit, just briefly.
I'm going to say 30 seconds, and then Sergio's going to have the last word. So on the Brexit thing, I did a big project on Brexit and its implications on the peace process with colleagues last year. And I interviewed a veteran IRA man, been involved in the struggle for 50 years. And I said to him, what do you think the consequences are of Brexit? He said, I think there'll be a united Ireland as a result of Brexit. And he says, and whenever we look back on the struggle, there will be a statue built for Boris Johnson in Crossmaglen in South Armagh, the heart of Republican territories. There will be a statue built of Boris Johnson in Crossmaglen, South Armagh. That's the implication of Brexit. On your question, Aiel, on the international bit of that question, I think Roisin's right in terms of the parachuting dynamic and people coming in to solve your problems. However, in our context, what was really useful, once we got to the stage organically ourselves where we wanted to resolve this thing, then international help was huge. I mean, we had Senator Mitchell chairing the negotiations. All of the really tricky bits, the decommissioning process, for example, we had to bring in external actors. We brought in Sir Ramaphosa actually to help with that process. We brought in the former Finnish Prime Minister. We brought in a Canadian general to oversee it. So on the policing issue, really difficult. We brought in a lot of international experts, Clifford Shearing, and he's already got a name check, but Brian Curran, who's a brilliant South African human rights lawyer. He's one of my heroes. Like, he's just a class act in every sense. He oversaw the release of political prisoners, and then he did that brilliant work with Roisin. So we had people of really high skills and good faith helping us, but we had to get to the stage where we invited them in. We also had President Clinton, putting his, he really helped, the European Union really helped. But we had to get to the stage where we wanted to do this thing, and then we asked for help, and we got lots of brilliant help from international actors.
We did.
Sergio, over to you to finish on a high.
No. So, first question of the two cultures. Let me begin answering by talking about something completely different, which is the invasion of Ukraine and what people are thinking about this. And I work quite a lot on this myself. And I mention this simply because I was recently in a discussion with a Ukrainian on some of the standard issues, and she was saying, and I was saying, that you had to be very careful not to transpose the usual kind of mechanisms, solutions that you have in internal conflicts to this situation, because it was an international conflict, and because it's not, in the end, you're not talking about one polity coming together. You have to be careful with what you do. Some things you can apply, but other things, they're different, because you don't want to live with the Russians if you're Ukrainian. You may have to have some kind of understanding later on, but this is not the issue. Now, if you move here, well, I mean, if I may be allowed to speak very freely, well, I think the situation now, the great crisis in Israel, would kind of put a question mark on that question, which is it so obvious that the two cultures, and that's the problem? Or if I say, I mean, I don't know this part of the world that well, but I know it a little bit. It seems to me that a businessman in Tel Aviv and a businessman in Ramallah may have much more in common than a businessman in Tel Aviv and a very militant, very orthodox settler in their view of how things should work. So the question is, how do you actually create mechanisms and spaces to at least get some basic understandings? But in the end, it also, I mean, I think this is but it's part of the really difficult thing here, is that if you don't have some idea of where it is you're going to land in terms of what you're talking about your polity, then it's very difficult to see how you deal with this. Now, to this I would add actually also, well, I mean, even for Israel itself, I mean, 20% of the population are Arabs. I think it's very nice that the Minerva Center still has Arabic on its thing here, and so it's a big issue. And I think it's more how can you exploit things that have done in other places to get people that are very different to come together and build consensus about basic things. This we might kind of very general, perhaps not very useful contribution. On the issue of international actors, I'll say something strange, which is, first of all, I'm kind of fundamentally against international actors, simply because I am against mediators in principle. I think that people should be given responsibility to solve their own problems. And, for example, the South Africans had this massively difficult negotiation, and they did it themselves. We did ours ourselves. But more seriously, actually, I think what you need to do is exactly what Kieran said, which is, you take responsibility and then you identify what your needs are. Case of Northern Ireland, because it's small, but it's massively difficult because this sentiments are very profound, and the reaction of the communities is going to be very strong. So you actually need to get President Clinton to call in on Friday, Trimble, and say, look, we're behind you, do this, we'll hold your hand, and that makes a big difference. So I take away some of what I just said, right? But this is because you have to know what you're doing. What you mustn't do is let the international community lead. This is what I think. And finally, on the issue of the local actors, I'll just mention one thing, which is, and it's not so relevant but perhaps yes. When you have a really long conflict, a really intractable conflict, then those who are doing the kind of top-level negotiations think that this is what you need to do. But in places like Colombia, where you've already had a number of groups to mobilize, the communities are much more skeptical. And they wonder whether this is actually going to bring change. And I learned a lot from a very great friend of mine who comes here so often, was a professor at Notre Dame called Jean-Paul Lederach, who's written a lot on peace building, which is semi-legendary. But he has this very nice concept of what he calls distance, the distance of the community, like the skepticism. Okay, you tell me you have priests, but actually, what is this? And what that means is that you're actually going to have to do a lot of work. And what you did in the peace agreement, and that actually worked really pretty well at the beginning, but then we had a government that came in that was against and really sidelined a critical part of implementation, which was creating spaces for people to come together and come together with government institutions. And I developed a whole almost doctrine about this, which I call territorial peace, and it actually went down quite well. But it was actually based partly on some of John Paul's ideas about how to shorten this distance by gradually getting people to come together through mechanisms where they had to jointly decide things. So you actually have to do a lot of thinking and design of this as much as you do of the bigger negotiation.
Thank you, sir. Listen, folks, that was a cracking session. I think you'll agree.
Do I get to ask my question?
Sorry, no, you haven't got time now. We're going to break up a call. We can do it later on. That was a cracking session. I think one of the takeaways for me was, you have this man involved at a macro level. You could not get more serious political negotiations, armed groups showing creativity, tenacity, but you have this woman working at a grassroots level. The skill sets is exactly the same in terms of that kind of work. Tenacity, hard work, creativity, smarts, and patience. So would you please express your appreciation in the usual fashion?